I'm Anselm Hager. I'm based at Humboldt-University, and it's great to be here. And I'm happy to hear that French internet is worse than German internet, because I thought German internet was the worst. Thank you for organizing this.
Okay, then I'm the next. My name is Katharina Schulze. I'm a member of the Bavarian State Parliament for the parliamentarian group, the Greens, and I'm there the head of my parliamentarian group. And I'm happy to be here and to discuss with you.
Yes, my name is Anke Hassel. I'm a professor of public policy at the Hertie School in Berlin. I'm the co-director of this Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my name is Ruediger Bachmann. I'm a professor of economics at Notre University. My alma mater is Yale. That's probably why I'm here. And I'm also a member of the so-called Donnerstagsrunde at the Treasury Department in Germany, which is sort of a loose connection that started up during the COVID crisis, a loose meeting of German economists and German politicians, mostly in the finance ministry and the Ministry of Commerce. Yeah, that's why I'm here, I guess.
So I think Anselm starts now with the presentation.
Perfect. Okay. So let's see. I guess I hope we'll see this. Yes. So I tentatively titled this "What's Up with the CDU?" because Isabela asked me to talk about the CDU, the big loser. And I guess the question is how we went from the left photo to the right photo in this election. We, that is the CDU in this case, or Germany rather, or Germany's governing party up until 2017. Perhaps just to set the stage, because I think even some people in the CDU didn't quite realize this. The CDU lost the election and they lost it big time. I think just to sort of give you some numbers here, they came in second after the SPD, which hasn't happened in a while. And they also lost 9 points compared to the last election, so down from 33 to 24. And they also scored the worst ever. So this is the worst result they ever got. So the CDU really, there's no doubt, no denying, even though they may think about it differently, really lost this election. And what's more than a really bad position, because they're sort of on the not far right, but center right. They cannot go into a coalition with the AfD, or they said they won't. And so they're really sort of in this Downsian space, not in a good position. So CDU lost, and there are some other parties that won handsomely, and I think others are going to focus on them on the panel. Now, I'm just going to offer sort of 7, 8 points on why I think the CDU lost. This is not causally identified. This is just my take on why I think they lost as a political scientist. But yeah, so here we go. Number one, which is sort of the least abstract, is that they really had a bad campaign. So the CDU's campaign was really bad, and I'm not just feeling that. I have a survey here by Cive that really shows this quite nicely, that the CDU campaign was the worst, at least in the impression of the voters. And the SPD's campaign, the Social Democrats, really gained quite some momentum in the last 2 months of the campaign. Why was the campaign bad, to my mind? Well, there really was absolutely no message. As a matter of fact, I met someone the other day who worked for the ad agency that the CDU hired, and she doesn't vote CDU usually, and she said it was just a complete nightmare, and they just couldn't sort of get one message across. And so the CDU really stood for nothing. And this, I think, is fine if you're sort of running on the governance ticket, but Merkel stepped down, so the new candidate had to campaign on something, and I think they failed in doing so. The second thing is they had a lot of sort of hiccups during the campaign, so things just not working out, the candidate laughing on camera, all sorts of issues that people or voters thought were not professional, essentially. And the third thing is that there was a lot of infighting. Now, you may or may not know that the CDU has a sister party, and they together form this union. And the sister party just really took pleasure in tormenting and destroying the campaign for 3 months. And this really didn't help the CDU, to my mind. So number one, the campaign was bad. Number two, the voters wanted something new. This is another survey from Civi here, where voters were asked, do you want sort of change in 2021 or do you want continuity? And only 20 or 19% of voters wanted continuity and 55% wanted change. Now that is bad news for a conservative party that prides itself in really just sort of running the ship smoothly and not really having any sort of substantive topics. So after 16 years of Merkel, I think voters had enough and they needed something new, and the CDU sort of did not stand for change, obviously. And the other thing is that there were sort of the challenge that voters saw were in line with what the CDU usually sells. I'm going to talk about that in a second. So number two, voters wanted something new. That's why the CDU did not perform well. Number three, and I hinted toward that, the election was mostly about non-CDU topics, or rather, the primary topics that voters cared about were not the topics that the CDU is good at. So this is another poll on the right. And here we see that the top topics in this election was welfare or anything to do with social security, followed by the environment. The classic CDU bread and butter issues, which is security and economy, were third and fourth. So this is bad if the top two topics are not what the CDU stands for, and hence it plausibly led them to perform poorly in this election. So number three, not an election about topics that the CDU is really good at or has competence in, at least in the voters' eyes. Now, number four, and this sort of gets into more structural things, the CDU in this election lost its base. Usually, the CDU is a lot of old people voting very regularly. Now, in this election, they didn't just not mobilize the old voters actually moved to the SPD. And this is pretty unheard of. And so anyone who studies party identification is going to, turn in their graves and think, why could this be that people that are above 60 are switching to the SPD? And this is exactly what happened. It's not just that they didn't mobilize their base, it's that the base voted Social Democrats. So 60 plus voters here voted more SPD, 35% than CDU. This is really unheard of. So lost the base, didn't just not mobilize it, lost it, at least in this election. Number five, this is not very unusual, but it certainly didn't change in this election, is that young voters vote green and liberal. They vote sort of progressive, if you classify the liberals as progressive. And this didn't help the CDU either, that sort of young voters that are going to the polls are really not voting for the CDU-CSU. Only 11%, 18 to 29 vote CDU. Now this in the long run usually changes, right? People get older, they become more conservative. Not necessarily, but often. But anyways, in this election really looked catastrophically bad among young voters. So old voters weren't there, young voters weren't there. And then the question is, who was there? Few people, only 24%. Okay, so young voters not voting CDU, or rather voting green and liberal, and I'm sure someone else is going to touch upon this, actually voting predominantly liberal, the young time voters. That's quite new and interesting. Now, six, this isn't new either, but I looked at some just off the press data. The AfD, the sort of far right party in Germany, is stealing the CDU conservative vote and base. Usually the narrative is, and it's true, that everyone sort of suffers from the AfD. All voters move to the AfD from all sorts of parties. That is true, but it's actually, I think, underappreciated just how much the CDU vote loses to the AfD. And you can see this quite nicely in this picture here on the constituency results from 2017 to 2021. Now you see two things. Number one, it used to be pretty much all black, which is CDU in this case. And then it turned much more red in 2021, not surprising. But also it turned blue. So the CDU really lost a lot of constituencies to the far-right AfD, particularly in East Germany, but also in other parts of Germany. So it's not just an East German thing that CDU is losing conservative voters to the AfD. This also happens in states like Baden-Württemberg. So the AfD is sort of chewing away at the CDU from the right, and that doesn't help either. So it's in this, again, this sort of Downsian setting. It used to be for the CDU that they said there should be no party farther to the right, and now there is the AfD, and that doesn't help, strategically speaking. Number seven, this should not come as a surprise, maybe to voters, maybe to the media, but I mean, if you look at election results as we do for a living, it's just been a downhill battle for the CDU for the last 30 years. So this is, they started off in 1980 at almost 50%, and now they're down to 25. So they've halved their vote share. There's some ups and downs. And clearly, as you can see, since 2013, it was a linear, dramatic trend down from 40 to 25. All that said, CDU is on a downhill trend. And this is not something that's sort of unusual. This has to do with many things, partly, conservative values are changing, new parties, et cetera, et cetera. Sort of this is quite well rehearsed, I believe. I should also add, it's not that that's not an issue for the SPD, right? So the SPD is not the big winner, and I don't want to talk too much about the SPD, but they also performed pretty bad. It's just that relative to what you thought where they were, they performed a little bit better. So it's all relative, right? So the SPD, like the CDU, is also on a downhill trajectory. Okay, so long-term trends also not working in favor of the CDU. I want to finish with two thoughts. The first is, which is sort of not an explanation for why they performed badly, but it's interesting that the CDU, unlike the SPD, say 15 years ago, still has sort of core competences, at least in the voters' eyes. This is another survey here, and this is asking people who do you think is most competent regarding the economy. And the CDU still sort of dominates that field. It also dominates the security field. So you would think, okay, they haven't lost their brand entirely. Yes, that's true. So if you ask me what's going to happen in the next election, I don't think they're going to go down to 15. Who knows? That said, if something super interesting is that you have a similar situation in one state in Germany, which is Baden-Württemberg. It's sort of where Porsche and Mercedes are made and a lot of money is being made, essentially. And the CDU used to really own that state. And they haven't lost an election in the last three election periods. And that's despite the fact that voters in Baden-Württemberg think the CDU actually is good when it comes to the economy, and yet they're still not voting for them. So what I'm trying to say here is that the CDU still has these sort of core competences, but it's not a guarantee that it actually mobilizes or persuades voters in the coming years. I want to finish up with something more fun and sort of pass the ball back to Isabela. This is the results in Charlottenburg, which is one area of Berlin. And one thing and this is an official result that was published. And what you can see here is that the Berlin Senate essentially faked data, and they said it was fine because it didn't really matter, but they literally faked data, and they've actually admitted to it, and the election official has stepped down. But I'm just showing you this because A, it shows Germans apparently can't organize elections, or at least Berliners. And second, it touches nicely into Isabela's work on sort of, the electoral developments in Imperial Germany and how they always manage to, fake results. And apparently this is still happening in 2021. So nothing new in Berlin. Thank you very much. And looking forward to the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Anselm.
Isabela, can I do a second? Yes, shall I just
Katharina?
go? Okay. Oh, Katharina. Okay, Katharina goes second.
Okay, I just start, and then after me, Anke, and then Ruediger, and then we are getting into the discussion. So I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to give you a short insight from an active party member. I'm a member of the Green Party, and I want to start with a confession. I mean, I love elections, I love campaigning, and mostly I love the election day. Why? Because you cannot do anything anymore, you can just wait, and then on this day you see if your hard work pays off. And especially at this election, and this federal election, it was particularly exciting because we are in Germany in very, very interesting times. Anselm already mentioned it. After 16 years of Angela Merkel, who was pretty loved by a lot of Germans, we had like a new situation. There was a window of opportunity for all the other parties to become the head of the government. And the other thing which was really interesting this time was that for the first time, 3 parties fought to lead the government. And one of the 3 parties was also us, the Green Party. Before that, it was always a battle between the Conservative or the SPD, the Social Democrats. And I would say in this election, the wind of change was in the air, at least a little bit, if we're looking at the results in the end then. So we as a Green Party put our hearts in this campaign. You know that we as a Green Party are mostly recognized for our environmental politics, but we worked very hard the last years to realign the party, to open it up to new social classes, to show that we also have a lot of good ideas in other fields, starting from security politics to social security stuff and economics, etc., etc. And we were as many party people as never before. So we got a lot of new party members who really helped us campaigning, door-to-door knocking, handing out flyers, big events in all the big cities. A lot of people were coming. And we as the Greens really had the feeling, okay, people want something new, as Anselm said. They are kind of, they don't want to have the great coalition anymore. They want new faces. They want something new. So we had a really intense election campaign and really put our heart into this campaign. And then the election day came, and at 6 p.m. I was sitting nervously in front of the TV when the results were coming in. And we as a Green Party, we had 14.8%. So our best result in history. And the other formerly big parties, the Conservative and the SPD, were fighting who is the number one. If I'm looking now at this result for the Green Party, for us, my evaluation would be like this. I'm honestly kind of torn, you know. I mean, it's the best result in our history. We are the election winners because we won a plus of 5.6% new voters. And I'm from the state of Bavaria, and Bavaria is a very conservative, structural conservative state. We managed to win a direct mandate there. So this is also historically. So on the one hand, I was pretty happy at this election night because we delivered and we had a very good result. But on the other hand, I think my whole party, we were hoping for a little bit more. Why? I would say on the one hand, we were the many months before the election, we were always second place. We were sometimes really close to the Conservative Party. And now we only finished at place number 3. So of course, we wished to be a little bit more further. And on the other hand, we were running for chancellor. So we have to say we didn't manage to become chancellor. So I'm just saying we're trying it in the next 4 years to become a chancellor again. And and we also made a campaign saying that we have so big challenges in our countries, starting at fighting the climate crisis, digitalization, a modern government, etc., that there is really an urge for something new, and we as a Green Party have the ideas how we can change it. But as I said, with 14.8%, we finished very good, but it maybe could be a little bit more. So what do I read out of the results? I would say there is a significant social desire in this result for a political force that drives the necessary changes. How do I see that? I see that because we, the Greens and the Liberals and the SPD won, and the Conservative Party, as Anselm also pointed out, lost big time. So for me, the Great Coalition is voted out, and the next government, regardless of how it is composed, urgently needs to tackle these challenges, and this is climate protection, strengthen social cohesion, and make the economy sustainable. And I think the second thing which we can see out of this election is that the political landscape in Germany changed. There are no longer two big parties and some small ones. It's more kind of two parties around 20–25%, and then two other parties around 14 and 11%. So we have a shift in the political landscape in Germany, which is like manifested in this election night. And I would say the third thing, what I read out of the results, and there I have to, Anselm, I have to refer to you. You said the voters wanted something new. I would add the voters wanted something new, but not too much. Why would I say not too much? Because the winner of the election was the SPD with Olaf Scholz. And there you can see, of course, persons matters. It's not only the content, what the parties are providing, but it's the person who's standing in front of the party. And Olaf Scholz from the SPD designed his whole campaign as Merkel 2.0, you know? Not too much change. You get what you had before with a little bit of change, but I'm still going with you in the right direction. So I would say, and maybe we can discuss it later, there was not like this big urge of we want to have something so new that we vote for a totally different party who was not one of the big two parties before. So what is happening now? Maybe that's interesting for you as well. There are now a lot of talks in Berlin. As you can see, there are two options how a government could be designed. The one is the Ampel. You would translate it in English, the traffic light. It would consist of the SPD, the Greens, and the Liberals. And the other option, which is still on the table, would be, we call it in Germany, Jamaica. That would be the Conservatives, the Greens, and the Liberals. And at the moment now, and during the weekend and the next days, these parties meeting together, they are talking about what do we have in common, what is different, can we form a coalition or not? And this is also maybe interesting for you, for the first time, the two smaller parties, Greens and the Liberals, started talking before they talked with the two big ones. And this, I would say, was kind of new in the political field. So we, the Green Party, we didn't wait till the SPD called us and said, hey, you want to meet? Let's talk. We talked with the Liberals first to have kind of an understanding. Do we have a common ground? Where do we want to go with this country? What are the things which are important for us? And then we have also the talks with the SPD and with the Conservatives. So you see, we are living in very interesting times, and I honestly think that a coalition can only be successful if this coalition has a big story, an idea where the coalition want to bring our country. I think let's do it like we did it the last 16 years will not help and will not hold this coalition together. So I would say it's now a really hard way to find a common ground and a good story and common values for the next 4 years, but I'm pretty optimistic that this will work out, and you can see the next days and weeks what we are doing here in Germany.
Thank you so much, Katharina. So Anke, next.
Yes, thank you very much, Isabela, for inviting me and giving me the chance to talk to you tonight. So what I would say sort of overlaps a little bit with what Anselm has already said, but also Katharina. And I would like to start with the main point is really the development of the CDU over the last 8 years or 10 years. And if you only think back about 2 years ago, the CDU was still the dominating party in the German political system. It was by far the strongest party. The SPD was largely written off by the voters, but also by the public per se. We had a history within the Social Democrats over the last almost 8 years where there was a lot of infighting, we had a lot of turnover in leadership, we had a constant loss of support, electoral support. And we had dramatic developments in terms of policy changes. So the SPD was really on its way out. And for some time, it looked that the CDU was the only popular or biggest party in town, the biggest party. And Angela Merkel was very much accepted internationally, but she was also very much accepted in Germany as a very strong leader. And we were on a success path. And even during the COVID crisis, the government was actually seen as rather successful as dealing with the COVID crisis, in terms of health outcomes, but also the economic management of the COVID crisis was all seen sort of pretty successfully. So the question is really, how did we get from a situation where the CDU was a dominant party and the only dominant party in the political system, and the CDU government, the CDU-led government was seen as a very successful government? How did we get from there to a situation, as Anselm has described, that the CDU not only had its worst result in the history of the country, but also lost from 8 years ago. 8 years ago, the CDU was roughly at 42%, and now it stands at just about 24%. So it lost really dramatically in this period of time. It lost dramatically in the Eastern Länder. Again, 4 years ago, the CDU was the dominant force in the Eastern Länder, and today it is the SPD. And in 3 states in the East, the CDU came third after the SPD and the populist far-right AfD. So this is a major and a dramatic development in the support for the CDU. But when we look at it, we can see how the cracks appeared earlier, because we should also think back of how Angela Merkel tried to install her own successor, how the delegation towards the new leadership was orchestrated, and we know that it failed because Angela Merkel tried to give the leadership to her best ally, who was Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who was the Minister of Defense. She ran in an election campaign within the party. She succeeded in this election campaign, but she could not hold on to the power she had within the party. But she lost it pretty soon, and she had to hand it over to Armin Laschet. And this sort of the process of her not being able to hold on to power, but really being toppled by prominent and important networks within the party, which were really sort of governed by eminent people in the background of the party, showed that there were cracks within the party and there were power struggles. What we also see now, and what we particularly saw in the election campaign, that the CDU did not really have a platform. They did not really have a program. The program they presented was really last minute and did not contain any relevant idea on how they would want to govern the country in the future. The candidate talked a lot about modernization, but couldn't really spell out what he meant by modernization. And it also weakened him further because it indicated that the government of Angela Merkel did not manage to modernize the country, that we had so many gaps and deficits in the country that now, after 16 years, the CDU started talking about modernization. And it was really not a very successful campaign, as Anselm has shown. And the candidate was really a candidate who is not up to the task, and how a party which was so powerful before chose a candidate which sort of obviously for the electorate is not really up to the task, really became a problem. So the question is really, how did we get there? And secondly, if we look at the SPD, and Anselm has also showed that in his graphs, the SPD has had a similar process, but it has had this process about 10 years earlier. So the decline of the SPD really started earlier, and they went down, and everyone is, 6 months ago, no one would have believed that the SPD could win the election. Everyone would have believed that the CDU is a clear winner of this election. So it came as a surprise that Olaf Scholz, who always maintained that he could pull it off, but it came as a surprise to everyone else, that he said, I can win this election, and I can win the election by presenting myself as the heir of Angela Merkel, because I'm also a very rational person. He is not very emotional, he's not very approachable, and at the same time, he is very modest in his own lifestyle. So he really presented himself, I am the real heir of Angela Merkel. And somehow, because the CDU really messed up the election campaign, this paid off. But it only paid off in the last couple of months, and it only brought them about 5% more than they had in the last election, which was a disastrous election. And the outcome of both of these developments, so the CDU really losing very badly, the SPD gaining 5%, but not really gaining a big majority, means that both big parties, which used to be the Volkspartei, which used in the past to get between 30 and 40%, both of them have no more than 26%. And that means that both big parties are really weak and are not the dominant force in the German electoral system anymore. And that gives a lot of space to the smaller parties. And the smaller parties are the Green Party, as Katharina has said, but also to the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party stands at about 12%, the Greens stand about at 14%. So they now join forces. They build a coalition now, the Green Party and the Liberal Party, and they, as a coalition, if they can really pull this coalition off, they can really choose the government, the party who they want to go into government with. So they are the kingmakers of the game. The Green and the Liberals have the choice of either going with the CDU, which is rather unlikely because the top candidate is so weak and the party is so divided, or they can choose to go with the SPD, which is the biggest party. And the interesting aspect of this coalition is that it is not a natural coalition. If we look at it historically, the Greens and the Liberals did not have much in common historically. But if we look at policies, they have something in common. Because they have something in common, they are very much focused on innovation. They believe in innovation. They also believe to some extent into market-based innovation. The Green Party is closer to a state-led approach like the SPD. But the leader of the Green Party, Annalena Baerbock, has talked a lot to the business community, for instance, for over the last year. And when they talked about the climate transformation that the country is facing, she knows that that industry and the business community will play a big role. And that is pretty much closer also to the FDP. So I think in some of the climate change policy, they will have a common ground in a lot of the digitalization, the digital transformation, innovation, research, but also on topics like civil rights or human rights or migration. The FDP and the Greens can cover a lot of common ground. They have a big problem when it comes to fiscal policy and taxation, and I would say something about that in a moment. But the other aspect, which is also very interesting, and that is something that Anselm has also alluded to, is really the generational gap and the generational shift we can see now moving from the old parties. And I would say the CDU and the SPD are not only old parties because they go way back historically, but they're also old parties because they both rely very much on the elderly as their core constituencies. The CDU definitely, but also the SPD in the past had a very old membership, but also a much older electorate. And that is different when it comes to the Greens and the Liberals. The Greens and the Liberals are young parties. They have a young support system. They have a young electorate, as I already mentioned. Among the first-time voters, they get the biggest shares of the votes. So they really represent a generational change, and that this election is a lot about a generational change. We can also see in the fact that the SPD, as I said, the SPD had this dramatic decline 10 years earlier. The SPD has already tried to push the younger generation much more. About a third of the new MPs in parliament going for the SPD are under 40. So they have a very young parliamentary group. The Greens also have a young parliamentary group. So the younger generation that is really unhappy with the status quo and also with the way the country was run over the last 8 to 10 years, they are really pushing for change. And you can see that best expressed in the FDP and the Greens, because they are really reflecting the younger generation. So maybe just 2 more comments on what is happening now. So we have this coalition. They have to hammer out their positions between themselves, the Greens and the Liberals, in order to present a package to either the SPD or the CDU. And the big problem is really taxation and fiscal policy. The FDP is very hawkish in its fiscal policy. They presented a tax reform, which was the biggest tax reform of all parties which were standing, which amounted to about 87 billion euros. They wanted to have a tax relief of 87 billion euros. And especially they wanted to have a tax cut for the rich. They really wanted to cut the taxes for the rich. Everyone earning more than 150K should have a tax cut of about 10%, which is a huge change. Yeah. And the Greens, on the other hand, their tax proposals were more the opposite. They went more with the social democratic perspective that they really want to have tax cuts for poorer and lower middle class families. And they wanted to have tax increases for the rich. So on the topic of redistribution and taxation, they have a really big problem which they have to solve. My hunch is what will happen is that nothing will happen on the tax front. I think they will just cancel each other out. They will not get the tax relief that the Liberals are going for. They will not get the tax increase of the Greens that they want to tax higher, the higher incomes. But pretty much on taxation, not much will happen. And the problem is then, how can you finance the transformation which you need in order if you want to invest in climate change? And that is the big open topic where we really don't know how they will do that, because they have to mobilize a lot of money to invest into infrastructure, to invest into climate change technologies, etc., where it's not quite clear where the money should come from. It might come from a sovereign trust. We don't know, but that is the policy issue which will really make a difference. And the last point I want to make is both big parties, as I said, have become weaker. Both big parties are not the dominant parties anymore. And the CDU knows that, because the CDU is in such a bad place, both in terms of personnel, but also in terms of policies, but also in terms of public reputation. The perspective of the CDU at the moment is pretty bad, and they pretty much have accepted they will not get into government. But the SPD does not know that. The SPD believes that the SPD won the election because they gained 5 percentage points. Olaf Scholz ran a brilliant campaign. He's doing very well for his party. And the party on the whole think that they gained a lot of strength. So I think when the Greens and the Liberals present their package to the SPD, and when they will negotiate a coalition agreement with the SPD, the biggest problem will be for the SPD to realize they're not really the dominant force in this game, but the parties in the driving seat are the Greens and the Liberals, and they pick the winner. They pick the SPD to go into government, but the SPD is really not the winner of this election campaign, even though they think they are. And I think that might be a friction, and that might be a potential point that this coalition might not come together and might not work at all. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me as well. I'll structure my remarks around 4 topics. I will just quickly respond, if I may, to something Anke said. Then I will speak briefly, a little bit about demography and polling before this election. Then I will also do some strategizing about potential coalitions. And then indeed, I will zoom in on the traffic light coalition and look at fiscal policy, economic policy more generally, where I think common themes could be, and where I think a compromise could ultimately lie. So the first remark is I want to take a little bit issue with the statement that the SPD was kind of on its way out or something like that. It's true that the SPD, and Anke said this correctly, and Anselm showed it very nicely, the SPD had reached rock bottom like 8 to 10 years ago. And so afterwards, it kind of was flat, it was flattened out. And that is true certainly in the federal level, that you might have thought that the SPD is a goner. But if you actually look at the Länder results, I think you will realize that the SPD might have been stronger and the CDU already weaker than you actually thought. Because what the SPD still has is sort of very important Länder where they basically have a stronghold, right? For example, and this is often together with very charismatic prime ministers, which is the German equivalent of state governors, right? For example, Malu Dreyer in Rheinland-Pfalz is basically uncontested. The SPD is very strong there. You have it in Hamburg, which is an important city-state, where the SPD is super strong. You have it in some eastern states, where the SPD is super strong. While if you look at it closely, the CDU, except for Bavaria, which is not the CDU, but its sister party, you know, really only had North Rhine-Westphalia, which was where the prime minister is still, and probably soon will have been, the CDU candidate, right? That was the only sort of strong conservative liberal stronghold of old. The CDU has prime ministers, but in coalitions that are very rainbowy, kind of, right? And all over the place. And it's difficult to argue that, you know, that they are sort of, that they're still the decisive party there. So if you look at the Länder results, it's not so clear to me, actually, that at least you can, if you look at the federal developments, it's easy to underestimate the SPD and overestimate the CDU. But if you look at the Länder results of the last 8 years and how, you know, where there are strongholds, also a big state that the SPD has been successful is Niedersachsen, right? A big state in terms of just area. Anyway, so I kind of wanted to put a little bit of a caveat on that. My second point is about the demographers. I thought actually, and there was a lot of talk about, you know, is this going to be, are the polls accurate? You know, how should we think about the polls? And I will say, in the end, it turned out that they were pretty good, actually. They got, indeed, there was this there was the CDU sort of 4 weeks before election, had really hit rock bottom. One poll had them at 19%. But then sort of the CDU started this old scare campaign against a left of center coalition. And, you know, arguably it worked a bit. You know, they had a little bit of a rebound, which ultimately led them from 19% to 24%. And the polls more or less reflected that, right? And while they kept the SPD steady at around 25%. The polls were also very good at predicting the catastrophic loss, really, which we haven't touched on yet, of the left party, of the successor party of the former of the SED, of the former German Democratic Republic, so the extreme left party, which had a catastrophic loss, right? It almost didn't make it into parliament. It only because of quirks in the German electoral law did they even make it. And my hunch is they're probably a goner at the federal level. There will be one more period of 4 years in the federal parliament, and then will be essentially become, if anything, a regional party of the German East. Right? That's another development that the demographers got pretty well. So I think the thumbs up to the demographers. There were some details that it didn't quite get. But overall, I thought it was a good election for the demographers, we had previous elections, for example, the last state election in Sachsen-Anhalt, which the demographers completely got wrong at the end of the day. Okay, then I want to strategize a little bit about coalitions, sort of taking up the thread where Anke left off. I also think that the traffic light coalition is kind of the most plausible, the most it's kind of in the air. I agree with that. I also agree with Anke, and I kind of want to make that point even more strongly. However, I don't think I think people are currently underestimating the probability of it being successful. In particular, the SPD. I mean, the SPD has not behaved very well. I mean, actually, Olaf Scholz, the candidate, has behaved very well by basically not saying anything publicly. But some from the party elders and the party grants have behaved in an impossible way towards the FDP, which is ultimately the party they have to convince. The Greens, we can talk about that. They are more easily convincible for a traffic light coalition, but the FDP is the one that deeply mistrusts the SPD. They have trust. They have their personal relationships between the CDU that Armin Laschet, the CDU candidate, represents, right? The top candidate, Christian Lindner, and the top of the Liberals, and the top candidate of the Conservative, the CDU. They have already formed the government in North Rhine-Westphalia, though they trust each other. And trust is very important for the for the Liberals, because they've been basically screwed over twice by Angela Merkel. Once in a government and once they pulled the plug before that, and they're extreme. They don't want this to happen to them again. Okay, and so, and when you hear some party bosses of the SPD calling the economic policy program of the SED, of the FDP, voodoo economics and stuff like that, you know, if you want to date, you don't want to dismiss, you don't want to tell your potential dating partner that you're ugly, which is currently what some of the SPD people are doing, actually. And I think Anke is exactly right. They're completely misreading the tea leaves. They think they won the election in a way they just didn't. Okay. Fortunately, I hope Olaf Scholz can actually pull the plug here, and I think he has already. Those attacks on the FDP have calmed down. But anyway, this is by no means over, and especially since Armin Laschet, whose political future is basically an all or nothing situation right now. Armin Laschet being the candidate of the failed candidate of the CDU, it's basically either he becomes chancellor, or he is basically a backbencher in the German parliament. I mean, he already has said that he will not stay as prime minister in North Rhine-Westphalia. Once he is not chancellor, he will have to give up the party presidency, the party chairmanship, and so he will be a nobody in the parliament. That's out. So it's either the most powerful job, one of the most powerful jobs in the world in the Western world for him, or a party backbencher. And you can see what his incentives are, right? Armin Laschet, for his political survival, needs to make the Jamaica coalition happen in a way that I'm not sure the SPD is quite willing to do, especially some on the party left in the SPD. And so you can see that it's just going to be a much more convenient partner in a coalition, Armin Laschet, for the Liberals and the Greens. And so it's very possible that in the end, they can actually get a more attractive package for themselves with a very weakened CDU and a candidate that is fighting for his political life, especially since some very influential, and Katharina can comment on that, I hope she will comment on that, some very influential sort of elder party people in the Greens are actually quite open to a Jamaica coalition. I think Robert Habeck is a fan of the Jamaica. He organized himself in one of the states. The only prime minister of the Greens in Germany has come out publicly that he really wants Jamaica, and these are important voices in the Green Party. And so we'll have to see how the Greens themselves will solve that inner party conflict. Then on the other end, you have the young Greens that say, over our dead bodies, we are never going to vote for a Jamaica coalition, right? So that's also going to be very interesting how that is going to play out. Do I still have 3 minutes for my fourth point? Some remarks. So now let's and then of course, you know, if sort of if neither the Jamaica, and so for example, but then the question is, can they even get together, the Liberals and the Greens? And if they don't, you know, there still could be. It's not completely out of the question. Not now. Now it seems out of the question. But once it's 4 weeks down the road and these coalition talks have made no progress, we could still see a grand coalition under the leadership of Olaf Scholz. I mean, with flipped power structure, and I think that the CDU, the Conservatives, would do it. They would boot Armin Laschet, and there's enough posts and enough jobs to be gotten for the CDU, even in the as a minority party in the grand coalition. So I wouldn't completely rule that out at all. It seems unlikely now, but let's see what happens 4 weeks down the road. All right, last point is I want to talk about how, now I'm talking about it as an economist, how from an economic policy point of view, and I think that's sort of one of the important elements of negotiation in these coalition talks, how a compromise could look like. I think the idea of the FDP to have a special depreciation program, especially for digital and ecological investment, a super Abschreibungsprogramm, as Christian Lindner called it, I think is appealing to everyone, because you don't have to, you say it's a depreciation and acceleration program, and you don't call it a tax decrease. That is sellable to kind of both left and the liberals. I'm not sure about the taxes. I think here's what I'm sure about. I'm sure there won't be a general wealth tax, which is the Greens and what the Greens and the SPD is asking for. That there's just no way this is going to happen with the FDP. This is sort of a red line that the FDP will never cross. I do think they will actually talk about a reform of the estate tax in Germany, which indeed needs a reform anyway. And they will do it in a way that they will probably lower rates and increase the tax base. And so in a way, you can't really identify was it a tax increase or not, because Christian Lindner promised his voters no tax increases. So politically, you have to hide any tax increases by making a structural reform where you might actually increase the revenue out of that tax, but you say lower rates and increase bases and stuff like that. And that's also, from an auto liberal point, lowering rates, increasing bases, something that Christian Lindner will be able to sell. So I think if you get a substantive wealth tax, it's going to come through the inheritance tax, not the actual wealth tax. I think that's out of the window. And finally, in terms of the income tax, I think what's going to happen, there's not going to be tax increases on the rich, but there's also not going to be tax decreases on the rich. But I do think that they will do some tax decrease on the lower income, middle income, because that's something that everyone can agree on. And I think they will find creative ways, and Lindner has essentially intimated that he will be okay with that, to at least initially be relaxed about the German debt ceiling. Right? There's sort of, if you think about the German debt brake, it has a constitutional element, which is super hard, which you can't reform because you would need the CDU to reform it. And everyone is already agreed that we're not going to reform it in this 4 years. And so that's unlikely. But below, sort of, whenever you have a constitutional requirement, there are sort of simple law, simple law behind that actually puts that into place and sort of specifies the details and how you implement the constitutional requirement. And how you implement the constitutional requirement, you do have there's a lot of creative work that you can do, and because it's simple law, and you can change the simple law without the 2/3 majority. So I think that's what they will do. There's some ideas out there. We can get into the details of that. And then finally, I think there's going to be we're going to see a tough increase in the CO2 price. There will be some negotiation, and this is going to be tough because the Greens really want to do this with sort of micromanagement, a lot of details. The FDP, if you take them at face value, they say they want to have a hard cap, and you can't do more. You can't emit more than the hard cap, which in some sense, if you think about it, is the hardest climate change policy, the toughest climate change policy. But of course, then they're a bit weaselly and wishy-washy about, what exactly the path is going to be. And when Germany is going to be climate neutral. So what I think the compromise could be that the Greens really is going to, so that they will probably end up with a cap and trade system, a quantity system, but the Greens will really put them on you got to do this faster, you got to be finished earlier. And the reason why I think it's going to end up with that solution is because the European Union already has basically in place a hard cap and trade system for all sectors of the economy, or not in place, but it's planned to have it in place by the mid-20s. And you might just as well start that system a little earlier in Germany. And I think the Greens will challenge the FDP to make that much tougher than the FDP would like. But I think the general framework will come from the Liberal Party. That's where I think the lines of compromise might lie. But Katharina can correct me if I'm wrong there.
Thank you very much, all. If there's anyone who wants to react to another panelist before we open it up for discussion. No. So I'll ask Eugenia to moderate and Cristobal to go first with his question that he put in the chat box.
So hi, I'm a graduate assistant to the program, also a graduate student in European Russian Studies here. So the first question was for Professor Hassel. could you comment a bit more on the reasons behind the internal fracture within the CDU and the SPD? Also, can you identify common structural reasons, or was the fragmentation in both parties due to particular reasons? Sorry, the question a little bit structured in odd language.
Yes, I think there is an explanation which focuses on structural trends within modern societies, and an explanation that has to do with policies. And I think in both parties they come together. So the structural trend in modern societies is that we have an urbanization of societies. We also have a upward mobility to higher education. We have modernization trends, and all of these trends mean that the traditional values of both big parties, in the case of the CDU, which was really Catholic-based and lower middle classes and middle classes, and on the one hand, and with the SPD, the center-left party, which was really based on a working class tradition, also trade union-based tradition, based on people with lower education or with mid-level education, that these strongholds in these big parties cannot really just continue, but these strongholds are declining, so the working classes are declining, or at least they're changing. You know, the type of the working class is changing. You don't have manufacturing working class anymore, but you have a service sector working class, which is very different, which is much more diverse, which is based much more on migrants, etc. So these traditional communities are just disintegrating. And these were the strongholds where the big parties got most of their votes. And this is a long-term trend, and they have problems to mobilize their traditional voters. But in both parties, you also had sort of key events. And in the SPD, you had the key event of the welfare reform in 2002 to 2003, when the unemployment system was quite radically reformed by a center-left government, by the SPD itself, which on the left of the party was really seen as a major sin, as a left-wing party, you would liberalize and deregulate the welfare system. And since then, you had a power struggle within the party of how to interpret this. Yeah? And you had one part in the party, which was more the sort of Tony Blair third way, we have to modernize the country sort of wing in the party, which said, we need to do that. We have to rely on activation policies in the labor market in order to bring people into work. But you also had the more traditional left within the party, which said you're selling out the rights of the working class, and these are the people who are voting for us. So this power struggle within the party played out at all levels and frequently led to a situation that the more sort of right-wing candidates that the SPD put up for election were attacked from people within the party, and the disunity in the party really damaged the party in their electoral campaigns. And then on the CDU, you had a similar situation, and the similar situation was really the refugee crisis in 2015, when Angela Merkel took a decision to welcome refugees into the country, and where the CDU said, this is not really our traditional policy stance on migration, but also not necessarily on political asylum. And within the CDU, you got the cracks within the party of people who supported that as a way of modernizing the party in a very different Germany, who tried to accept the fact that we are now living in a much more diverse society, in a multi-ethnic society, and said, the CDU as the key party has to accept that. But you also had people more on the right of the party who said, this is really not what we believe, this is not in line with our traditional values, our conservative values, and who then started to attack Angela Merkel, and then which then fed into the AfD and the populist side, etc. So you also had this momentum that you had an emerging power struggle within the party. And as I said, in the CDU, you had that in 2015, and ever since the party has been in turmoil, and there are different factions that try to gain the upper hand. So long-term structural trends, but also key moments in the party's history, which showed that there is a deep conflict within the party.
Thank you. The next question goes for everyone from Toby White. Where does the AfD fit into this result? Why did they lose their ground? Did their pivot to rebellion against COVID restrictions hurt them that badly, or did the immigration crisis just abate enough to take the wind out of their sails? Is there any future election where the CDU do in fact partner with the AfD? The Germans seem to have more successful marginalized the right populist than the French, Italians, and Brits. Why is that? To sum up, what is the outlook for the AfD, and how did they end up in their present position?
Maybe I can start with one thing and then you add something else. We have a big debate about the AfD in Germany. We have a strong civil society who always brings this topic up, and a lot of also journalists who are looking into the how the AfD members are close to neo-Nazis and how they are all a big group and stuff like that. So we are talking a lot about that. And I think one very important thing is that at one point our Verfassungsschutz, I think it's in English, the I don't know, does somebody know what Verfassungsschutz means? Defense.
Not the FBI. In America, it would be the FBI.
Okay, yeah, kind of like, yeah. And
no, the CIA would be the BND.
And
that's the equivalent.
Okay, but whatever, a state institution looked into the AfD and said, okay, maybe we have to monitor you because you're not standing on our values. And I think some people maybe then were thinking, oh, well, maybe I now if the state is maybe now looking into it, I should maybe go a little bit away from this party. But from my personal point of view, I'm now speaking as a politician, I think we are still having too many people voting for this right-wing party. And now that they are the second term in the Bundestag, they also get money, for example, for a foundation, so they can build a stronger backbone for their party, which I personally dislike, and I hope we in Germany can push them back into the corner and that they're not getting any bit more bigger. But I'm interested how the others, maybe they have some other explanations too.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think there's some good news and some bad news, I would say, as far as the AfD is concerned. The first one is that federally, they indeed did not gain. I think, in fact, they lost a little bit, but essentially they stayed stable. And I do think that, there's strong opposition overall as in the aggregate against the COVID policies of the federal government did not help them, because overall Germans were okay with how the Grand Coalition, and frankly, in conjunction with the Greens and mostly of the Liberals, handled. So this was kind of a very centrist kind of policy, centrist reaction. And so I don't think there was much political ground to be gained. But here's the bad news. The gains and the performance of the AfD in the East in particular is indeed worrisome. I mean, we have now one state that could be soon, plurality at least, right-wing populist, namely Sachsen, and Thüringen and Sachsen-Anhalt are not that far away, especially Thüringen, right? And so that is just concerning that you have sort of that you have this concentrated power, right? And this is not meant to blame East Germany, but there's East Germany, parts of East Germany where the AfD plays essentially no role. Take a look at Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, right, where a strong SPD prime minister governs. And so I think it's a question of heterogeneity. Okay. The other thing I will say is what Anke has described for the CDU. You also have a little bit in the AfD as well. There is an inner party fight, and this came out actually right on the next day of the election. There's a strong inner party fight of people, of the so-called moderates, although I'm not sure how you can be moderate and be in the AfD, but of the so-called moderates that sort of are the old, that often sometimes even used to be members of the CDU, of a right-wing CDU, and so then separated from the Merkel CDU because Merkel pushed the CDU too much in the middle, or maybe too much left in their views. And then you have literally neo-Nazis right now in there. There's a fraction of basically plain old traditional neo-Nazis, and that's an inner party fight. And inner party fights are never good. They're not appealing to the electorate, okay? And so especially not to a conservative electorate that still doesn't quite like the play with neo-Nazis, right? They are conservative people in Germany that maybe think that Merkel governed too much to the left, but still feel a little uncomfortable going neo-Nazi all the way, or quite uncomfortable for obvious historical reasons. And so this projection of the party as both being fractured, but then also as essentially also incompetent, right? And sort of so there doesn't seem to be a topic where the AfD seems to have, just in terms of substance, expertise, or at least projects expertise into the electorate. They're basically against everything that everyone else is doing, but it's not clear what they really want or where they have expertise. So that this combination of projecting incompetence and fracturedness, I don't think has made them a super attractive party this election around. And so I think it's kind of understandable why they kind of, flattened out. That's my take.
Thank you. Yes, so we have a question from Moritz Manuel Bandelli. I will let him speak it out.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. I have two quick questions, and I'm going to make it very brief. I'm a PhD student at Yale. The first one is, what happened to Die Linke in this election? Obviously, like their vote share is slightly below 5%. And of course, sort of their disappearance from federal politics could really change the landscape also for the SPD. So what's your long run projection for Die Linke? And the second question is a grand coalition led by the SPD altogether inconceivable? Given that it's always easier to have a coalition between two rather than three parties, say if, the traffic light falls apart, is that completely off the table, that there could be just, another grand coalition, just like basically we had in the last election after Jamaica fell apart? Basically, you went back to what you know already. Thank you so much.
Maybe
I answered that already, so I will shut up.
So on Die Linke, my hunch is sort of two things. Number one, the protest party or the anti-establishment party is now the AfD in East Germany, so they've really lost that ticket. And also their voters that are diehard left party voters are dying out. So I don't think they're gonna, be gone in the next election. They're still getting, got 3 direct MPs. They might get 6%, but I think long term it's not looking too good for them, which is of course great for the SPD, because then they're finally have gotten sort of rid of that enemy that was chewing away on the left. The second question on the Grand Coalition, I think it's just like Ruediger said, I don't think it's very likely right now. But don't underestimate the CDU's thirst for power. They love to govern, and they would do next to anything to govern. And you can see this in Baden-Württemberg, where for the second time they joined a junior coalition with the Green Party without any issues. So they call themselves the Kanzlerwahlverein, which is like their only purpose is to elect the chancellor. And I guess now they're the Vize-Kanzlerwahlverein. But I wouldn't underestimate it, but still, I think it's very unlikely, and I think the traffic light coalition will work out, will be my hunch.
Can Katharina say something to that? I would be super curious to hear someone from the actual parties involved.
Yeah, I would totally agree what you, Ruediger and Anselm just said about the Great Coalition revival. because also during the election campaign, for example, Olaf Scholz was asked one time, do you want to do a red-red-green coalition? So SPD, the left, and the Greens, or the Great Coalition again? And he said, okay, I want to do the Great Coalition again. So the image which some of the SPD members are drawing, like, oh, we would never go back into the Great Coalition again, I don't believe them. You know why? Because first, last time they did it as well. And second, now they are the strongest. And Olaf Scholz will tell their Genossinnen und Genossen, their SPD members, like, you know what? This time everything will be different because I'm the chancellor, and Kevin Kühnert, who's from the Jusos and who was against the Great Coalition the last time a lot, he's now a member of the German parliament, then maybe he's getting kind of and he will be in government too, or whatever he's then giving to all these people. So I would also say this ghost is not away from the table. And I think it's important for my party and for the FDP to have a really good look on that, that not maybe behind our back, these two partners trying to sort something out as well. So if a three-party coalition will not work out, they can do another coalition again. So yeah, that would be my guess.
Isabela?
Thank you so much. I just want to have a final question from a student, which Evgeny is going to ask. But if I may just interject, if I may just interject my question here, which is, now that Germany has a new party system, which is very similar to that in Nordic countries, much more fragmented, is the option of a minority government being at all sort of considered, given the differences, the strong differences in policy between the Greens and the FDP? Is Germany ready for a minority government? No.
I think that's a step too far. I think that's a step too far. So I think we maybe next time, maybe now we're starting with a three coalition and then let's see what's happening. But I mean, as Anselm pointed out, people want to change, but not too much. So having now a minority coalition would be kind of, whoa, what a crazy life. So I don't believe that.
It would also be hard to sell. I mean, there are two coalitions, clear two coalitions on the table, plus another grand coalition. So right now, I don't think it's sellable to the German voter.
It would also not be a good solution because, as you know, Germany is a federal country and we have a strong upper house as well. So the Bundesrat is sort of co-deciding a lot of things. And, the more people, the more compromises you have to make that even as the government, then again, with the upper house, it will become very complicated. So I'm not sure that the sort of parallels to the Nordic countries is the best one because, there are much more centralized states. And I think in combination with the upper house, I think it's very difficult.
Okay, so I just, I'm not sure. Go ahead, Jenya.
Yeah, sure. We have two more questions. I will open up these two last questions with the student from European Russian Studies program. So it's twofold question. First one is the prospects of the CDU-CSU Spitzenkandidat in 2025 elections. Will be Markus Söder take the lead? And the second question is, what is your estimation for the Greens' future performance in the larger cities, given the performance in Munich and Stuttgart, prior strongholds of the CDU and CSU? And the closing question from him is like, what the Olaf's standing regarding Macron's call for strategic autonomy in Europe?
Maybe I start with Markus Söder because I have him in my parliament in Bavaria all the time, and then I'm really interested how you see the future of my party. So I will not talk about my party, but I will talk about Markus Söder. I think if Markus Söder could get the power, he will definitely do it. I mean, He said this year, like 5, 6, 7 months, no, I will not run for chancellor. My place is in Bavaria. Nobody could hear that saying anymore. And then when he kind of smelled the option of getting into the fight, he said, okay, I can do it. And that probably, Anselm, because you said why it's these, the conservative also were so bad, I would add to your 9 points, 10th point, that these two sister parties did not do a common election campaign. Here in Bavaria, you nearly couldn't find any poster of Armin Laschet, the chancellor candidate. Who was in all the posters in our country? Markus Söder, who wasn't even running for the German Bundestag. So you could really see the two sister parties who were so close before kind of were arguing all the time, and there was not a team spirit. So Markus Söder, from his personality, and he's a really politician who does, I would say, nearly anything for power. If he could have the option to run for chancellor next time, he would definitely do. And it's now really interesting if the CDU have the power in the opposition, for example, to get strong again and to sort themselves out and maybe get some new faces in the first row and stuff like that. So that, I would say, is still open. My view from Bavaria.
Maybe I go next because I'll have to leave because I'm going to another conference very soon. In terms of the future of the Green Party, I think it's bright. And I think it would have been, and well, you like that, Katharina, but you will probably not like what I said next. I do strongly believe that the candidate was the choice of the candidate was a mistake. At the end of the day, it was clear that Robert Habeck would have been the better candidate, and I think they might have actually won with Robert Habeck the chancellorship already. If he runs next time, I think he has a good. I mean, obviously, this is way out, and lots of things can happen in 4 years. But if Robert Habeck were to run, he's so popular in Germany. I think if he were to run, I would. I mean, again, depending on competitors and whatever, I would not exclude that he would be coming in first place. So, depending on how the Greens play it, they have a chance at the chancellorship next time around.
Yeah. So, and for now we have one last question, but maybe we'll have a few minutes because like they are flowing still. So from Mark Jacob, it seems that you all agree that CDU has lost the election. Why is it so hard for them to admit that in public, and why has party leader Laschet still not stepped down? So please, pretty harsh question. Somebody want to answer? Anke?
I think the fact that he hasn't stepped down or that he hasn't declared defeat also shows that he was the wrong candidate. I think he makes bad political judgment, and he should at least sort of accepted defeat on the night. And the public doesn't sort of appreciate him sort of maneuvering and saying, we have also sort of, a mandate to form a government because, you can form a government if you have a majority in parliament, etc. So all these sort of gestures he made did not make him much more popular and just showed that his political instincts at that level are not going so well. On the other hand, the CDU wants to be there as an opportunity and a possibility that if the other coalition talks break down, that they can step in. I mean, and that is something they have to do. I mean, they have to present themselves as a partner who, if everything else fails, is there to form the next government, and because they think they can do that, and that is what they're there for. So it is a bit tricky to say, okay, I accept defeat, but at the same time, if everything else fails, we are here to enter negotiations. This is the position they have at the moment, but they should have made it clear sort of, on Sunday night and not yesterday or the day before. So it just shows that they're not very well positioned.
Okay, so we will have to end now, and I just want to thank all panelists for their comments and for their kindness and willingness to join us on this occasion. And we just wish all of you, since you all contribute to German politics in one way or another, good luck in the coming months. Good luck in the negotiations. I know you will all be involved in policy, and good luck in kind of in the in solving the energy problems and the social policy problems that Germany has. So it's a very exciting moment for Germany and for all of you. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting.